15 years is a massive portion of a human life, especially when those years encompass the prime of your adulthood. We live in an American society that constantly preaches the gospel of self-actualization, of climbing the corporate ladder, of building personal wealth and establishing individual boundaries. We are told from a very young age that our time is our most valuable asset. Yet, there is a dark, silent parallel reality operating right beneath the surface of all that aggressive individualism. It is the reality of the unspoken family contract, a trap built entirely on guilt, expectation, and the illusion of eventual reward. Sarah Hastings fell into that trap so slowly, so insidiously, that she never even noticed the doors locking behind her. She traded her late 20s, her entire 30s, and the beginning of her 40s to be the full-time, unpaid, and heavily abused caregiver for her mother-in-law, Eleanor Hastings. Sarah gave up a thriving boutique interior design firm in Soho, a career that was just starting to catch fire and get featured in prominent New York lifestyle magazines. She traded color palettes and architectural blueprints for medication schedules, adult diapers, and the crushing, suffocating atmosphere of a sprawling, drafty estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. She did it because her husband, Mark, asked her to. He did not force her, of course. The American patriarchal dynamic rarely uses outright force anymore. Instead, it relies on a much more sophisticated brand of manipulation. Mark was a senior partner at a cutthroat corporate law firm in Manhattan, billing 80 hours a week, climbing his own ladder, building his own empire. He convinced Sarah that bringing in outside nurses would break his mother's heart, that Eleanor needed family, that old-money Connecticut families like theirs did not outsource the care of their elders to strangers. He promised Sarah, looking her dead in the eye in their massive gourmet kitchen, that this sacrifice would not be forgotten, that they were a team, and that taking care of Eleanor was the ultimate investment in their shared future. For 15 agonizing years, Sarah was the ghost haunting the Hastings estate. Eleanor was not merely physically declining, she was psychologically vicious. She was a woman born into generational wealth, a woman who viewed kindness as a weakness and gratitude as a currency only poor people needed to spend. Eleanor wielded her influence and her sprawling fortune like a weapon. Every sponge bath Sarah gave her, every midnight emergency, every humiliating cleanup was met not with a thank you, but with a critique of Sarah's background, her lack of pedigree, and her failure to provide Mark with children. Sarah endured it all. She swallowed her pride, burying her own identity so deeply under the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law that she forgot what her own laugh sounded like. She rationalized the abuse using the coping mechanisms we so often see in cases of long-term emotional captivity. She told herself that Eleanor was just in pain, that the dementia was talking, that this was simply the harsh reality of elder care. But deep down, holding the entire fragile structure together, was the unspoken American promise of compensation. In our culture, suffering is supposed to have a payoff. There is always the implicit understanding that endurance will be rewarded at the finish line. Eleanor herself played into this brilliantly. During her lucid, manipulative moments, she would casually mention the family trust, the liquid assets, the prime real estate. She would reach out with a cold, frail hand, grip Sarah's wrist, and whisper that loyalty is the only thing that matters when the final accounting is done. Sarah did not do it just for the money, but the money was the anchor that made the unbearable feel slightly justified. It was the physical manifestation of the gratitude she was otherwise denied. Then, on a freezing, brutal Tuesday in November, Eleanor Hastings finally died. Her passing was not peaceful or poetic. It was a messy, exhausting bodily failure that left Sarah physically shattered and emotionally hollowed out. There was no grand revelation on the deathbed, no tearful apology for a decade and a half of cruelty. Eleanor simply stopped breathing, leaving Sarah standing in the master bedroom, staring at the antique wallpaper she had hated for 15 years, feeling an incredibly complex mixture of profound relief and terrifying emptiness. The funeral was a masterpiece of high society theater. It was held at the most prestigious Episcopal church in Greenwich. Hundreds of people who had not visited Eleanor in a decade showed up to mourn. Mark stood at the front, playing the stoic, grieving son perfectly, shaking hands with senators and CEOs. Victoria, Mark's younger sister, flew in from Manhattan. Victoria was an art dealer who had conveniently stayed away for the entire 15 years, claiming her sensitive, creative soul simply could not bear to see their mother in such a degraded state. At the funeral, Victoria wore a custom designer black dress and wept beautifully, accepting condolences for a burden she had never carried. Sarah sat in the front pew, wearing a simple dark suit, completely invisible. People offered their sympathies to Mark and Victoria, often looking right past the woman who had actually kept the matriarch alive. But Sarah did not care. She told herself that the performance was almost over. The long, dark chapter of her servitude was closing, and a new life was about to begin. She fantasized about restarting her design career, about moving out of the gloomy Greenwich estate, about finally having a marriage that was not entirely orbiting the black hole of Eleanor's needs. Exactly 1 week after the funeral, the family gathered at the offices of Sterling and Vance, one of the most elitist planning law firms in New York City. The conference room was a monument to old money intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, heavy mahogany paneling, the scent of expensive leather and old paper. Sarah sat next to Mark. She felt a strange sense of calm. This was the moment of validation. This was the closing of the contract. The attorney, Richard Sterling, a man with perfectly styled silver hair and a voice completely devoid of emotional inflection, opened the thick leather-bound folder on the table. He went through the standard legal boilerplate, his words hanging heavily in the climate-controlled air. He revoked all prior wills. He established Mark as the primary executor. And then, he began to distribute an estate worth north of $60 million. Sarah listened carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Richard read out the charitable donations first. $1 million to the Greenwich Historical Society. $500,000 to the local country club to maintain the golf course. $2 million to a private conservative political action committee Eleanor had favored. Sarah felt a slight twinge of annoyance at the frivolousness of the donations, but she waited. Then came the individual bequests. Victoria was given the luxury penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, entirely mortgage-free, along with a portfolio of liquid assets designed to ensure she would never have to work a day in her life if she chose not to. Victoria dabbed her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief and nodded gracefully. Then, Richard turned to Mark. Mark was bequeathed the Greenwich estate, the entire family trust fund, the controlling shares in the family's various corporate holdings, and the vast majority of the remaining financial assets. It was a total and complete transfer of dynastic power and wealth directly to the male heir. Richard Sterling closed the thick folder, folded his reading glasses, and looked up at the three of them. He offered a tight, professional smile and asked if there were any questions regarding the administration of the estate. Sarah sat absolutely still. The silence in the mahogany room was deafening. She waited for the addendum. She waited for the separate trust, the personal letter, the specific mention of the woman who had sacrificed her youth, her career, and her sanity to wipe Eleanor's mouth and manage her medications. She waited for her name. But the attorney was already sliding the paperwork toward Mark for his signature. There was nothing else. 15 years of absolute devotion, 15 years of enduring psychological torment, 15 years of putting her entire existence on hold, and Eleanor Hastings had not left her a single solitary dime. Not a piece of jewelry. Not a nominal sum. Not even a written acknowledgement of her service. Sarah looked at Mark, expecting to see shock or outrage on his face. She expected her husband, the man who had begged her to take on this terrible burden, to slam his hand on the table and demand an explanation. But Mark did not look shocked. He looked completely serene. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his expensive fountain pen, and began signing the documents with the practiced ease of a man who already knew exactly what those pages contained. In that chilling, perfectly quiet moment, gazing at her husband's steady hand, a horrifying realization began to crystallize in Sarah's mind. She had not just been erased by a bitter, vindictive old woman. She had been systematically used, managed, and discarded by the entire system sitting at that table. The true nature of her reality was just beginning to reveal itself. I want you to think about the precise moment when the architecture of your entire reality collapses. It rarely happens with a cinematic explosion. More often, it happens in absolute sterile silence, just like the sound of a fountain pen scratching across heavy bond paper. Watching Mark sign those documents in that mahogany-paneled room, Sarah experienced what trauma psychologists call a sudden catastrophic cognitive dissonance. For a decade and a half, her brain had operated on a very specific narrative. She was the savior, the essential linchpin holding the Hastings family together, and Mark was her grateful, overwhelmed partner. But the steady, unhesitating movement of his hand across the signature line violently shattered that narrative. He didn't pause. He didn't ask Richard Sterling, the attorney, to double-check the annexes. He didn't even shoot a sympathetic glance in Sarah's direction. He simply signed his name, effectively claiming his empire and legally validating her erasure. Let us talk about the drive back to Greenwich from Manhattan. It is roughly an hour depending on traffic, an hour trapped in the soundproof, leather-scented cocoon of Mark's Mercedes S-Class. In American culture, we place a massive emphasis on communication. We go to couples therapy. We read self-help books. We are told that talking is the key to resolving conflict. But what do you do when the person sitting next to you has just demonstrated, definitively, that they do not view you as an equal human being? You sit in silence. Sarah looked out the window at the gray blur of the Connecticut Merritt Parkway, feeling a cold, creeping numbness spreading from her chest outward. Mark drove with one hand on the steering wheel, classical music playing softly from the satellite radio. He seemed entirely relaxed, perhaps even slightly relieved. It was the posture of a man who had successfully closed a long, difficult merger. And in many ways, that is exactly what the American marriage has become. In the upper echelons of society, a corporate merger, where human beings are treated as depreciating assets. Sarah wasn't a partner. She was an operational expense that had finally been written off the books. When they pulled into the winding, tree-lined driveway of the estate, the sprawling stone mansion looked fundamentally different to Sarah. For 15 years it had been her workplace, her prison, the site of her daily humiliations and physical exhaustion. But now, as the heavy wooden front doors loomed ahead, she realized it was no longer even hers to hate. It belonged solely to the man walking briskly ahead of her, the man already checking his phone for emails. The illusion of shared property, the what's mine is yours myth that sustains the middle-class American dream, does not apply to generational wealth. The Hastings money was protected by a fortress of legal structures, trusts, shell companies, offshore accounts designed specifically to keep outsiders out. And Sarah, despite wearing a Hastings wedding ring for 20 years, was unequivocally an outsider. The cracks in the facade began to widen significantly over the next few weeks, revealing the deeply entrenched machinery that had been operating behind her back. We often assume that betrayal is spontaneous, a sudden lapse in judgment. But true, devastating betrayal is logistical. It requires planning. Enter Arthur Vance, the senior founding partner of the law firm they had visited, and a man who had been Eleanor's personal confidant for decades. Arthur was an 80-year-old remnant of the old boys club, a man who viewed women like Sarah not as family members, but as temporary contractors. A few days after the will reading, Sarah found a heavily redacted invoice from Arthur Vance's private consulting firm buried in Mark's home office trash. The dates on the billing hours were revealing. They corresponded exactly to the period, 7 years ago, when Eleanor had received her initial Alzheimer's diagnosis. While Sarah had been frantically researching memory care specialists and retrofitting the ground floor bathrooms with grab bars, Mark and Arthur Vance had been quietly structuring a fortress around the estate. They hadn't been preparing for Eleanor's care. They had been preparing for her death, specifically ensuring that when the time came, the wealth transfer would be absolute and impenetrable by any marital claims. But the legal maneuvering was only the sterile, bureaucratic side of the betrayal. The deeply personal, human element arrived in the form of a young woman named Chloe. Chloe had suddenly appeared in the house roughly 6 months before Eleanor's death. Mark had introduced her casually as a specialized estate manager, an administrative assistant hired by his firm to help him handle the overwhelming amount of paperwork associated with his mother's declining health and financial holdings. Chloe was 28, held an MBA from Wharton, and dressed in sharp, minimalist designer suits that stood in stark contrast to the comfortable, stain-resistant clothing Sarah had been reduced to wearing. At the time, Sarah was too exhausted, too deeply buried in the physical demands of hospice-level care, to question Chloe's presence. She had even felt a brief, pathetic wave of gratitude that Mark was finally taking some of the administrative burden off her shoulders. Now, in the hollow aftermath of the funeral, Chloe did not disappear. In fact, her presence in the Greenwich estate became more pronounced. She was there early in the mornings, drinking coffee in the gourmet kitchen that Sarah had once designed. She was in Mark's study late into the evenings, their voices a low, steady murmur behind the heavy oak door. Sarah started observing Chloe through a new, deeply cynical lens. She noticed the way Chloe anticipated Mark's needs, the familiar way she poured his evening scotch, the distinct lack of professional distance in their body language. The American cultural narrative loves the trope of the older, wealthy man leaving his aging wife for a younger model. It is a cliché so common it borders on banality. But what Sarah was uncovering was far more insidious than a simple midlife crisis affair. This wasn't passion. This was a corporate transition. The true nature of this transition became horrifyingly clear on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Mark was in the city, and Chloe had supposedly gone out to run errands for the estate. Sarah, driven by a desperate, clawing need to understand the exact dimensions of her ruin, finally broke her own moral code and accessed Mark's private laptop. It wasn't heavily secured. Mark's arrogance made him careless. He believed Sarah was far too thoroughly subjugated, too beaten down by the years of caregiving, to ever mount an investigation. He underestimated the absolute clarity that comes with having nothing left to lose. Sarah bypassed his simple password and opened his private email client. What she found wasn't a collection of torrid love letters. It was a digital paper trail of a meticulously executed extraction plan. There were emails between Mark, Arthur Vance, and a high-end divorce attorney that dated back 3 years. 3 years ago, while Sarah was sleeping on a cot at the foot of Eleanor's bed because the old woman was terrified of the dark and prone to violent night terrors, her husband was coldly calculating the cost-benefit analysis of discarding her. The emails detailed a strategy so ruthless it took Sarah's breath away. Mark and the lawyers had realized that in the state of Connecticut, an equitable distribution state, a divorce after a 20-year marriage could potentially entitle Sarah to a significant portion of the assets generated during the marriage, and possibly even alimony that would bleed Mark's personal income. However, inheritances are generally considered separate property. The strategy was brutally simple. Keep Sarah occupied, exhausted, and financially dependent as the unpaid caregiver. Do not divorce her while Eleanor was still alive and the estate was in flux. Let Sarah do the grueling, soul-crushing labor that would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in private round-the-clock nursing care. Let her burn through her prime earning years so she had no independent career or savings to fall back on. And then, once Eleanor died and the $60 million estate was safely, legally locked into Mark's sole possession as an inheritance untouched by marital commingling, he could initiate the divorce. He would walk away with generational wealth, and she would walk away with the clothes on her back and a resume that had a 15-year gap. The emails involving Chloe were the final, sickening puzzle piece. Chloe wasn't just an assistant or an impending mistress. She was Mark's exit strategy manifest. She had been brought in specifically to organize the post-Sarah reality. Chloe was handling the liquidation of joint assets, the subtle transfer of funds from shared accounts to private offshore entities, and the scouting of luxury condominiums in Manhattan for Mark's new, unencumbered life. Chloe was quite literally cataloging the inventory of Sarah's life, preparing it for the dumpster. Sitting in the dim light of Mark's study, staring at the glowing screen, Sarah didn't cry. The time for tears, for the performative grief of a neglected wife, had passed. What replaced it was a cold, hard, crystalline rage. This is the dark underbelly of the American contract, the reality that all the positive psychology and self-empowerment podcasts gloss over. Sometimes, you are not the protagonist of your own life. Sometimes, you are just collateral damage in someone else's business plan. Mark hadn't just stolen her youth. He had commodified her empathy. He had weaponized her fundamental human decency, her willingness to care for a dying woman, turning her greatest moral virtue into the instrument of her own financial and social execution. The devastating truth wasn't just that Eleanor had left her nothing. The devastating truth was that her husband had orchestrated it from the very beginning. He had built a slaughterhouse, painted it to look like a family home, and calmly led her inside. There is a specific kind of terror that sets in when you realize the person you share a bed with is not a human being, but a highly functioning algorithm programmed for your destruction. When Sarah sat in that dimly lit Greenwich study, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the exact architecture of her ruin, she did not scream. We are conditioned by Hollywood to expect dramatic outbursts, shattered glass, weeping on the floor. But real, catastrophic trauma in the American upper middle class does not look like a soap opera. It looks like absolute, paralyzing stillness. Sarah was experiencing the profound psychological shock of a paradigm shift. Every single memory she had of the last 15 years, every late night conversation, every shared holiday, every time Mark had kissed her forehead and told her she was an angel for taking care of his mother, had to be instantly rewritten. He was not a tired executive leaning on his devoted wife. He was a predator observing his captive prey. In Western psychology, we talk a lot about the concept of the dark triad: toxicism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Mark Hastings was a walking, breathing masterclass in all three. He had institutionalized his cruelty, wrapping it in the socially acceptable disguise of a concerned son and a hard-working provider. Sarah meticulously forwarded every single email, every drafted legal document, every spreadsheet Chloe had created to a secure, newly created email address. She moved like a ghost in her own home, wiping the browser history, placing the laptop exactly where she had found it, adjusting the angle of the screen down to the millimeter. Survival instinct is a terrifyingly efficient mechanism. She went back to the master bedroom, lay down next to the man who was actively plotting her annihilation, and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up over the Connecticut hills. The next morning, the environment shifted. The implicit contract had been fulfilled on Mark's end. The money was legally his, and therefore, the performance was no longer necessary. It is truly chilling how quickly the mask of civility slips when a sociopath no longer needs anything from you. Mark came downstairs for breakfast dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, looking incredibly vibrant, almost vibrating with the energy of his newly acquired wealth. He poured himself a cup of coffee, completely ignoring Sarah, who was standing by the sink. He did not ask how she was doing. He did not discuss the will or the fact that she had been entirely excluded. He simply looked at his watch and casually informed her, in the exact tone one might use to instruct a landscaping crew, that he was having the estate appraised, and she needed to clear her personal items out of the main bedrooms by the end of the week. He said he was moving into the master suite permanently, and she could occupy the small guest room above the detached garage until they figured out the logistics of their separation. He did not say the word divorce. He said separation. It was a calculated choice of vocabulary designed to keep her off balance, to dangle a tiny thread of hope that this was just a temporary marital crisis rather than a premeditated execution. Sarah did not argue. She nodded, her face completely blank, a perfect mirror of his own emotional vacancy. This lack of reaction unsettled him for a fraction of a second, but his arrogance quickly paved over it. He left for the city, leaving Sarah alone in the massive, echoing house. But she wasn't entirely alone. Chloe arrived 30 minutes later. The young, sharp-eyed estate manager walked through the front doors without knocking, carrying a clipboard and a posture of absolute authority. The psychological warfare had officially entered its overt phase. Chloe began walking through the house, tagging antique furniture, taking inventory of the silver, placing small, brightly colored sticky notes on items that had been in Sarah's life for 2 decades. When Sarah asked her what she was doing, Chloe offered a perfectly polite, entirely synthetic smile and stated that she was preparing a comprehensive asset ledger for Mr. Hastings's insurance policies. It was a masterclass in aggressive gaslighting. Chloe was establishing dominance, turning the domestic sanctuary into a hostile corporate environment. Sarah realized then the true utility of Chloe. She wasn't just there to do paperwork, she was a psychological wedge, an instrument designed to make Sarah feel so profoundly uncomfortable, so deeply alienated in her own home, that she would eventually pack a bag and leave of her own volition, abandoning any legal claim to the property. This is a common tactic in high-asset divorces. You freeze the dependent spouse out, you humiliate them, you cut off their access to the life they built, until the emotional pain is so unbearable that they surrender just to make the psychological torture stop. The financial squeeze happened exactly 48 hours later. Sarah drove to the local high-end grocery store to buy food. When she swiped her platinum credit card, the machine beeped a sharp, red denial. She tried another card. Denied. She logged into her banking app on her phone while standing in the checkout line, her heart hammering against her ribs. The joint checking account, which usually held tens of thousands of dollars for household expenses, showed a balance of exactly 0.00. The savings account was locked. The emergency fund was gone. The American financial system is entirely digital, which means financial abuse can be executed with a single keystroke from a Manhattan high-rise. Mark had stripped her of her purchasing power, reducing a 42-year-old woman who had managed a massive, complex medical care operation for 15 years to a dependent with no ability to even buy a loaf of bread. She left the groceries at the counter, the humiliation burning her cheeks, and drove back to the estate. She was a prisoner. She had no money, no current credit history, no income, and no career to fall back on. Her entire identity, her entire financial existence had been intrinsically tied to Mark's goodwill, and that goodwill had been a mirage. She needed counsel, but you cannot hire a divorce attorney in the state of Connecticut without a retainer, and the kind of attorneys who could fight Arthur Vance and his army of corporate litigators required retainers that looked like phone numbers. Sarah realized she had to operate entirely outside the system that Mark controlled. She went into her closet, dug into the back of a drawer, and retrieved a small velvet box. Inside was a vintage Cartier watch she had bought for herself 15 years ago, a celebration of her first major interior design contract, right before she gave it all up for Eleanor. It was the only asset of significant value she owned that Mark did not know about. She drove to a pawn shop in a working-class neighborhood 2 towns over, completely outside the Greenwich bubble. She sold the watch for a fraction of its value, walking out with $10,000 in physical cash. She did not use Google to find a lawyer. She knew Mark could track the IP address of the estate's router. She went to a public library, used a public computer, and searched for legal malpractice specialists in Queens, New York. She was looking for someone hungry, someone cynical, someone who despised the pristine, white-shoe law firms of Manhattan. She found him in a cramped, smelling office above a dry cleaner. His name was Thomas Miller. Thomas was a former corporate litigator who had been disbarred from high society practice due to a spectacular public battle with alcohol, but he retained his license and a burning, venomous hatred for the system that had chewed him up. He was exactly the kind of unpolished, street-level brawler Sarah needed. She sat across from his cluttered desk, handed him a thick stack of printed emails and spreadsheets she had extracted from Mark's laptop, and dropped the envelope of cash on top of them. Thomas did not ask about her feelings. He did not offer tissues. He put on his reading glasses and began to read. For 2 straight hours, the only sound in the office was the hum of the neon sign outside and the turning of pages. When Thomas finally looked up, his eyes were sharp, evaluating her not as a victim, but as a fascinating legal problem. He poured himself a glass of cheap whiskey, offered her none, and leaned back in his chair. He told her that Mark was not just greedy, he was a brilliant, meticulous sociopath. But the emails about the money, Thomas explained, were just the standard operating procedure for stripping assets. What caught his attention, what truly made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, were the medical logs Chloe had been meticulously compiling. Thomas pulled out a specific spreadsheet, highlighting the entries. He explained the brutal, unforgiving nature of the law. If Sarah filed for a contested divorce, claiming she was entitled to a portion of the estate's growth or demanding substantial lifetime alimony based on her 15 years of unpaid labor, Mark's attorneys would immediately motion to dismiss her claims based on character and conduct. But they wouldn't just argue she was a bad wife. Thomas pointed a nicotine-stained finger at the spreadsheet. This, he told her, was a weapon of mass destruction. Chloe had not been cataloging Eleanor's decline. Chloe and Mark had been retroactively altering the daily care logs. They had been documenting entirely fabricated instances of neglect. They had recorded missed medication dosages that never happened. They had documented mysterious bruises on Eleanor's arms, claiming Sarah had been rough with her during transfers from the bed to the wheelchair. They had even hired a private, unethical physician to sign off on a post-mortem evaluation that suggested Eleanor's final, fatal decline was exacerbated by prolonged malnutrition and dehydration. The room spun. The air vanished from Sarah's lungs. The deeper, horrific truth settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Mark wasn't just trying to leave her penniless. He was building a criminal case against her. He had constructed a perfect, legally binding narrative of severe elder abuse. Thomas leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. He explained the checkmate. The moment Sarah filed a lawsuit for her fair share of the marital assets, Mark would hand this fabricated dossier to the district attorney. In the court of public opinion, and in the deeply biased justice system, who would a jury believe? The wealthy, grieving son of a beloved local matriarch, supported by a polished estate manager and heavily credentialed doctors, or the exhausted, bitter, financially destitute daughter-in-law with no evidence to the contrary? Mark had engineered a situation where Sarah's only option to stay out of a state penitentiary was to walk away from the marriage with absolutely nothing, to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and to vanish into poverty. He had weaponized her 15 years of sacrifice and turned it into a loaded gun pointed directly at her head. She was trapped in an invisible, flawless cage, constructed entirely out of her own devotion. There is a specific kind of suffocating darkness that descends upon you when you realize that the American justice system, the very institution designed to protect the vulnerable, has been perfectly weaponized to ensure your total destruction. When Thomas Miller laid out the brutal architecture of Mark's trap in that cramped, whiskey-scented office in Queens, Sarah felt her mind fragmenting into a million sharp pieces. We are raised on a cultural diet of righteous triumph, fed the delusion that the truth will always prevail, that innocent people do not get destroyed if they just stand up and fight. But Thomas Miller, a man who had seen the bottom of the legal ocean, knew that in the high-stakes world of New York and Connecticut wealth, the truth is entirely irrelevant. The truth is merely a lump of clay, and whoever has the most expensive lawyers gets to sculpt it into whatever shape benefits them the most. Mark had sculpted a masterpiece of character assassination. He had not just planned a divorce, he had orchestrated a criminal conspiracy to frame his wife for elder abuse, ensuring that if she ever dared to ask for a single penny of the $60 million estate, she would be trading her freedom for a prison uniform. For a week, Sarah lived in a state of hyper-vigilant paralysis. She moved out of the main house and into the small, poorly insulated room above the detached garage, exactly as Mark had ordered. She watched from a frosted window as the life she had built was systematically dismantled. She watched high-end art appraisers walk through the front doors. She watched Chloe, the woman who was stepping into her life like a parasite taking over a host body, directing the moving crews, laughing with Mark on the patio, drinking expensive wine from the glasses Sarah had received as wedding gifts 2 decades prior. The psychological torture was exquisite. Mark was parading his victory, daring her to break, daring her to hire a desperate lawyer and make a move so he could finally drop the hammer of the fabricated medical logs and send her to a state penitentiary. He wanted her to run. He wanted her to pack her battered suitcase, sign a waiver of all claims, and disappear into the working-class obscurity she came from, broken and terrified. But Mark made a fundamental, fatal miscalculation. It is a miscalculation common among narcissistic sociopaths who occupy the highest echelons of corporate America. He believed that because he had stripped her of her financial agency, he had also stripped her of her intellect. He mistook her 15 years of quiet, exhausted servitude for inherent stupidity. He forgot that before she became Eleanor's full-time nurse, Sarah was a brilliant structural designer, a woman whose entire brain was wired to understand blueprints, recognize flaws in foundations, and visualize complex overlapping systems. Sitting in the freezing garage apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes of her meager winter clothing, Sarah stopped crying. The terror evaporated, replaced by a cold, absolute, terrifying clarity. If you cannot fight a monster in the courtroom, you have to fight them in the dark. She realized that Mark's perfect frame-up relied entirely on one specific assumption, that he controlled all the information regarding Eleanor's final days. He controlled the private doctor, he controlled Chloe, and he controlled the digital logs, but he did not control the ghosts of the past. 7 years ago, when Eleanor's dementia had first begun to manifest in terrifying, violent night terrors, she had a habit of wandering the sprawling Greenwich estate in the dead of night, turning on gas stoves and opening external doors. Sarah, desperate for a way to monitor the matriarch without staying awake for 72 hours straight, had hired an independent security contractor to install a series of hidden nanny cameras in the main living areas and, crucially, inside the ornate grandfather clock in Eleanor's master bedroom. When Mark found out about the cameras 3 years later, he was furious, citing privacy concerns and the legal liability of recording household staff. He personally tore the cameras out of the walls and ripped the main server out of the central wiring closet. He thought he had sterilized the environment. What Mark did not know, what Sarah had completely forgotten until the sheer pressure of her impending doom forced her brain to access deeply buried memories, was that the camera in the grandfather clock was never connected to the cloud or the central server. The contractor, an overly cautious paranoid tech from New Jersey, had hardwired that specific lens to a physical, solid-state backup drive hidden behind a false brick in the darkest, dampest corner of the estate's wine cellar. It was a closed loop, a silent, unblinking eye that had been recording over itself every 30 days for 7 years, completely disconnected from the digital world Mark so arrogantly controlled. The logistics of retrieving the drive were terrifying. Sarah had surrendered her keys. She was essentially a trespasser on the property despite still being legally married. She had to wait for the perfect alignment of circumstances. It happened on a Thursday evening. Mark had a black tie gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan, an event he was attending with Chloe, officially debuting his new, unencumbered life to high society. The moment the taillights of Mark's Mercedes disappeared down the long, winding driveway, Sarah moved. She slipped out of the garage apartment, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and bypassed the main alarm system using a backdoor service code she had programmed over a decade ago, a code Mark had never bothered to change because he simply did not pay attention to the invisible labor that ran his household. The house was completely silent, heavy with the oppressive weight of expensive antiquities and dark secrets. Sarah descended the narrow stone steps into the wine cellar. The air was thick with the smell of cork and old dust. She used the flashlight on her cheap prepaid cell phone, moving past rows of vintage Bordeaux, her hands trembling violently. She found the false brick behind a rack of dusty champagnes. She pulled it loose. Inside the dark, hollow cavity, sitting in a nest of cobwebs, was a small black metal box covered in dust. A red power light was still faintly glowing. The closed loop was still running. She disconnected the wires, shoved the box into her heavy winter coat, and fled the house, leaving through the kitchen door just as the automated security lights swept the lawn. She did not wait until morning. She drove her aging sedan straight to Queens, arriving at Thomas Miller's office at 3 in the morning. Thomas was asleep on his ancient leather sofa, an empty bottle of bourbon on the floor. Sarah woke him up, slammed the black box on his desk, and demanded he find a power cord and a monitor. Thomas, wiping sleep and alcohol from his eyes, recognized the manic, dangerous energy radiating from her. He dug through a closet of old electronics, found the necessary cables, and hooked the hard drive up to his desktop computer. The files were massive, completely unindexed, just endless hours of static wide-angle footage of an old woman sleeping, staring at the ceiling, or throwing things at the walls. Sarah calculated the timeline. She knew exactly what to look for. She gave Thomas the exact date and estimated time of Eleanor's death. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks ago. She remembered the night with excruciating clarity because Mark had done something highly unusual. Around midnight, he had come into the kitchen, acting deeply concerned about Eleanor's breathing, and handed Sarah a prescription slip. He told her the local pharmacy was out of stock, and she had to drive to a specific 24-hour compounding pharmacy in Stamford, almost 45 minutes away. It was a bizarre request given that they usually had a concierge medical service deliver medications, but Sarah was too exhausted to argue. She had driven through a driving rainstorm, waited an hour for the pharmacist to mix the compound, and driven back. By the time she returned to the estate, Eleanor was dead, and Mark was sitting in the armchair next to the bed, holding his mother's lifeless hand, his face a mask of solemn grief. Thomas skipped the video timeline forward to that exact Tuesday. They watched the timestamp hit 11:45 p.m. They watched Sarah, looking incredibly frail and exhausted in her oversized sweater, walk out of the camera's frame, heading for Stamford. For 10 minutes, the room was empty save for Eleanor, who was thrashing weakly under the heavy down comforter, clearly agitated but very much alive. Then, the heavy mahogany door opened. Mark stepped into the room. Sarah stopped breathing. In the cramped Queen's office, surrounded by the smell of stale tobacco and cheap liquor, the true, horrifying reality of her marriage unfolded on a high-definition monitor. Mark was not alone. Chloe stepped into the room right behind him. They were not acting like a grieving son and a concerned medical administrator. They were moving with the cold, synchronized precision of an execution squad. Chloe walked over to the IV pole that administered Eleanor's saline and pain management drip. She checked the line, completely devoid of empathy, her face blank and focused. Mark approached the bed. He leaned over his mother. The hidden camera in the clock captured the entire horrific exchange perfectly. Eleanor stopped thrashing. She looked up at her son. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, bitter recognition. The matriarch and the heir, locked in a silent dialogue of pure, unadulterated sociopathy. What happened next shattered every remaining illusion Sarah held about the nature of humanity. Mark did not use a pillow. He did not use his hands. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, pre-filled medical syringe. Chloe handed him an alcohol swab. Mark wiped the rubber port on the IV line. He inserted the needle and slowly, deliberately, pushed the plunger down, injecting a massive dose of an unknown, colorless liquid directly into his mother's bloodstream. Thomas Miller gasped, falling back into his chair, his hands shaking. Sarah remained perfectly rigid, her eyes wide, absorbing the absolute darkness of the scene. They watched as Mark stepped back. They watched Eleanor's body seize violently for exactly 10 seconds, her eyes rolling back into her skull before going completely limp. The monitors next to the bed began to scream a flatline warning. Chloe immediately reached over and silenced the alarms. Then, with chilling efficiency, Chloe took the empty syringe from Mark's hand, placed it in a biohazard bag, and slipped it into her designer purse. Mark leaned down, adjusted his mother's blankets, smoothed her hair, and sat in the armchair, adopting the exact posture of mourning he would be holding when Sarah returned an hour later. It was premeditated, cold-blooded murder. But as Thomas paused the footage, his cynical, legal mind began to race, connecting the dots of a conspiracy much larger than a simple inheritance grab. Why would Mark Hastings, a man who was destined to inherit $60 million anyway, risk the electric chair to speed up the process by a few months or even weeks? Eleanor was already dying. The dementia and organ failure were terminal. Murdering her made zero logical sense for a man so obsessed with risk management. Thomas began frantically typing on his keyboard, logging into a secure, dark web financial database he used to track hidden corporate assets for his more dangerous clients. He pulled up the shell corporations associated with Mark's Manhattan law firm and his private investment portfolios. He cross-referenced the dates, the frantic urgency of the emails he had read earlier, and the sudden appearance of Chloe. Within an hour, Thomas found the absolute truth, the foundational lie upon which Mark's entire empire was built. Mark Hastings was not a brilliant corporate lawyer. He was a spectacular, catastrophic failure who had been running a massive, illegal Ponzi scheme utilizing his wealthy clients' escrow accounts to cover his own disastrous offshore investments. The market had turned against him violently 6 months ago. He was facing a margin call of epic proportions. The SEC was secretly circling. Mark was approximately 48 hours away from total financial ruin, federal indictment, and spending the rest of his natural life in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He did not kill his mother to get rich. He killed his mother because he needed the $60 million estate, liquefied immediately, to cover his massive criminal debts before the federal auditors knocked on his door. Chloe was not just an estate manager or a mistress. She was a high-end corporate fixer, a cleaner brought in to facilitate the rapid liquidation of assets and ensure the medical timeline fit the financial deadline. And Sarah? Sarah was the ultimate scapegoat. If anyone ever looked too closely at Eleanor's sudden death, if an autopsy was ever forced, the altered medical logs that Chloe had fabricated would immediately point the finger at the exhausted, disgruntled daughter-in-law. Mark had planned to feed Sarah to the criminal justice system to cover his own tracks. He had weaponized her devotion, turned her into an unpaid hospice nurse, planned to steal her marital assets, and ultimately designed a scenario where she would take the fall for his mother's murder. The silence in the Queen's office was heavier than lead. Sarah stared at the frozen image of her husband's face on the monitor, realizing she had spent 15 years sleeping next to a monster so devoid of a soul it defied human comprehension. Thomas Miller looked at her, his cynicism entirely gone, replaced by a deep, terrifying awe. They possessed the footage. They had the evidence to put Mark and Chloe in prison forever. But Thomas knew how the system worked. If they went to the police, Mark's high-priced lawyers would drag the process out for years. They would claim the video was manipulated. They would use Mark's political connections to stall the investigation. And in the meantime, Mark would liquidate the estate, hide the money offshore, flee to a non-extradition country, and leave Sarah to freeze to death in a garage apartment, utterly destitute. Justice, the American kind of justice, was not going to help her. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to reclaim her life and punish the man who had tried to erase her existence, she could not act like a victim seeking the protection of the law. She had to act like the monster he had trained her to be. She had to execute a corporate hostile takeover of her own life, utilizing the very tools of extortion and psychological warfare Mark had used against her. She looked at Thomas, the reflection of the computer screen burning in her eyes, and told him they were not going to the police. They were going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The gala was still happening. The sociopath was currently drinking champagne, celebrating his perfect crime, believing he had outsmarted everyone in the world. It was time to show him what happens when the architect of a prison realizes the doors have been locked from the outside. There is a profound, almost terrifying beauty in watching a completely powerless individual realize that they hold the absolute instrument of someone else's destruction. When Sarah and Thomas Miller walked out of that freezing, smoke-stained office in Queens, the dynamic of power in this entire narrative had completely inverted. We often mistake justice for a courtroom, for a judge in a black robe and a jury of 12 peers handing down a verdict. But in the ruthless, hyper-capitalist ecosystem of the American elite, actual justice is never delivered by the state. Actual justice is a hostile corporate takeover. It is leverage. It is walking into a room holding a nuclear bomb and politely asking the other person to sign on the dotted line. The Metropolitan Museum of Art Gala is the absolute pinnacle of New York high society, a fortress of extreme wealth, impenetrable security, and performative philanthropy. It is where the masters of the universe go to drink vintage champagne and congratulate themselves on ruling the world. Mark Hastings and Chloe were inside that fortress, surrounded by billionaires, politicians, and media moguls, celebrating their brilliant, blood-soaked victory. They believed they had successfully executed the perfect crime, murdered the matriarch, framed the devoted wife, and secured the $60 million lifeline required to save Mark from federal prison. But they did not anticipate the sheer, unadulterated audacity of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Thomas Miller, drawing on his old, pre-disbarment connections, managed to secure 2 catering staff credentials. They did not walk through the front doors in designer gowns and tuxedos. They entered through the service elevators, blending in with the invisible, working-class machinery that makes the American upper class function. Sarah was wearing a simple, black uniform, her hair pulled back tightly, moving like a ghost through the labyrinthine corridors beneath the museum. She knew exactly how to track Mark. She knew his habits, his supreme arrogance, his absolute need to dominate a room. She found him in a semi-private alcove near the Egyptian wing, standing next to a massive granite sphinx, holding a crystal glass of bourbon, laughing a deep, resonant laugh with a group of hedge fund managers. Chloe was standing dutifully by his side, the perfect sociopathic accessory, her eyes scanning the room with cold calculation. Sarah did not cause a scene. She did not scream or throw her drink in his face. She simply walked up behind him, stepping directly into his blind spot, and whispered his name. The sound of her voice in that cavernous, echoing hall must have felt like a gunshot to the back of his head. Mark turned around, his smile freezing instantly, his perfectly manicured facade cracking for a fraction of a second as he registered the presence of the woman he thought he had completely neutralized. He immediately tried to reassert dominance, leaning in close, his voice a venomous, low hiss, asking her what the hell she was doing there and threatening to have security throw her onto Fifth Avenue. But Sarah did not flinch. She did not shrink away as she had done for 15 years. She pulled a heavy, metallic object from her apron. It was a tablet, preloaded and paused on a very specific, high-definition frame. It was the frame of Mark Hastings pushing a lethal injection of an untraceable chemical compound directly into his mother's foreline, with Chloe standing right beside him. She held the screen up, just high enough for Mark and Chloe to see it clearly, but shielded from the rest of the room. I want you to imagine the physical sensation of your entire biological system shutting down in sheer terror. That is what happened to Mark Hastings. The color completely drained from his face. His expensive bourbon slipped from his fingers, shattering onto the pristine marble floor. Chloe, the cold, calculating corporate fixer, physically recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. They were trapped. They were surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, and they were staring directly at their own murder conviction. Thomas Miller stepped out of the shadows then, wearing a wrinkled suit that smelled faintly of dive bars, radiating pure, predatory joy. He did not introduce himself. He simply handed Mark a thick, legal manila envelope. Inside that envelope was an irrevocable, non-contestable transfer of assets. It was a document Thomas had drafted in a manic, brilliant frenzy in the back of his sedan. The terms were brutally, beautifully simple. Mark was going to sign over the entire $60 million Greenwich estate, every single liquid asset, every offshore trust, every piece of real estate, directly to Sarah. He was going to completely waive any right to contest the transfer. Furthermore, he was going to sign a confession of his massive, illegal Ponzi scheme, detailing exactly how he had defrauded his clients and falsified his escrow accounts, effectively handing the Securities and Exchange Commission the exact blueprint they needed to destroy him. In exchange, Sarah and Thomas would not hand the murder tape to the district attorney. They would hold it in a secure, offshore digital vault, a permanent dead man's switch. If Mark ever tried to contact Sarah, if he ever tried to sue her, if he ever tried to rebuild his life, the video would automatically upload to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country. It was the ultimate extortion, a perfectly engineered trap built out of his own hubris. Mark tried to negotiate. He tried to offer her half. He tried to threaten Thomas, his voice trembling, sweat pouring down his forehead, realizing that his entire carefully constructed universe was collapsing into a black hole of absolute ruin. But Sarah leaned in, her eyes completely dead, completely devoid of the empathy she had wasted on this family for a decade and a half. She told him there was no negotiation. She told him he had exactly 60 seconds to sign the documents, or she would turn around, walk to the nearest police officer stationed at the museum entrance, and hand them the tablet. She reminded him that his margin call was due on Friday, that the SEC was already looking at his books, and that without the $60 million, he was going to a federal penitentiary for fraud regardless. The only choice he had was whether he went to a white-collar federal camp for financial crimes or a maximum security state facility for premeditated murder. It was the ultimate, crushing weight of consequence. Mark Hastings, the brilliant corporate attorney, the golden boy of Greenwich, broke completely. His hands shook violently as he took the cheap pen. Thomas offered him. He signed away his empire, his freedom, and his entire future on the marble edge of an ancient Egyptian tomb, weeping silently, a pathetic, shattered shell of a man. Chloe did not wait around to comfort him. The moment Mark signed the final page, Chloe turned and sprinted toward the exits, abandoning him the second he was no longer a viable asset, a perfect demonstration of the absolute loyalty of a sociopath. The aftermath was rapid, brutal, and entirely silent. Sarah did not go back to the Greenwich estate. She stayed in a cheap motel in Queens while Thomas filed the transfer paperwork through a series of blindingly fast legal maneuvers, securing the assets in untouchable trusts under Sarah's maiden name. 2 days later, just as Thomas had predicted, the federal authorities raided Mark's Manhattan law firm. The massive Ponzi scheme was exposed. The millions he owed to ruthless, dangerous investors vanished into thin air. Mark was arrested in his luxury penthouse, handcuffed in front of the world, his reputation utterly obliterated. He was facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The beauty of Sarah's revenge was that she never even had to accuse him of murder. She let his own financial greed destroy him. She watched his downfall on the news from her motel room, feeling no joy, no triumph, just a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. She had spent 15 years in a psychological prison, and she had finally managed to buy her own freedom using the very blood money her captor had murdered for. Healing, real healing from that level of profound psychological abuse and systemic exploitation, does not happen overnight. You do not just take $60 million, move to a tropical island, and forget that the person you loved tried to feed you to the wolves. Sarah took a long time to put the pieces of her fractured mind back together. She sold the Greenwich estate immediately to a Russian oligarch who tore the entire gloomy mansion down to build a modern glass monstrosity, effectively erasing the physical site of her trauma from the map. She did not keep the vast majority of the money. She kept enough to guarantee her absolute independence for the rest of her natural life, enough to ensure she would never have to rely on another human being for survival. The rest, tens of millions of dollars, she quietly funneled into anonymous trusts dedicated to funding legal defense teams for domestic abuse survivors, women who were trapped in high-asset divorces with sociopathic spouses, women who had their caregiving weaponized against them just as she had. She restarted her interior design firm, not in the high-pressure, superficial world of Manhattan, but in a quiet, artistic community in the Pacific Northwest. She designed spaces that were full of light, open air, and warmth, the exact antithesis of the dark, oppressive architecture of the Hastings legacy. She learned how to sleep through the night again without waking up to check on a dying, vindictive old woman. She learned how to trust her own instincts, to recognize the subtle red flags of manipulation, and to fiercely protect her boundaries. She never remarried. She realized that she did not need the validation of the American marital contract to exist as a whole, complete person. This brings us to the core of the psychological horror we have just unraveled. We live in a society that aggressively romanticizes sacrifice, particularly female sacrifice. We are told that caring for our elders, supporting our partners, putting our own ambitions on hold for the sake of the family unit is the highest moral calling. But what this story so brutally exposes is that sacrifice without legally binding protection, devotion without mutual respect, is just a socially acceptable form of indentured servitude. Mark Hastings did not value Sarah's caregiving. He commodified it. He looked at her empathy and saw a free labor force. He looked at her love and saw a vulnerability to be exploited. The tragedy is not just that Eleanor Hastings was murdered by her own son. The tragedy is that millions of women are currently trapped in their own versions of the Greenwich estate, slowly bleeding out their youth, their potential, and their financial security, believing that their sacrifice will eventually be recognized and rewarded by a system that was fundamentally designed to consume them. They are waiting for a payoff that does not exist. They are waiting for a place in a will that has already been rewritten to exclude them. You have to understand that true predators do not lurk in dark alleys wearing ski masks. In America, true predators wear bespoke suits. They have degrees from Ivy League universities. They sit at the head of the Thanksgiving table, and they look you straight in the eye while they calculate exactly how to extract every ounce of value from your existence before discarding the husk. They use the law not to protect the innocent, but to build impenetrable fortresses around their own greed. If you take anything away from this story, let it be the absolute necessity of radical self-preservation. Never surrender your financial independence. Never assume that the moral high ground will protect you from a sociopath with a good lawyer. And most importantly, realize that when the architecture of your life is built on someone else's terms, you are always just one signature away from being evicted from your own reality. This has been Sofia Coppola. Thank you for walking through the dark with me. If you want to hear more stories that strip away the polite illusions of our society and expose the raw, unfiltered truth underneath, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a rating, and share this podcast with someone who might need to hear it. Stay safe out there, keep your eyes open, and never let anyone turn your empathy into a weapon against you. Until next time.